mentally incompetent to manage a state, and one is mentally incompetent to consent to treatment. So the medical practitioner who issues a Form 3, Certificate of Involuntary Admission, must examine the patient to determine whether they are mentally competent to manage their estate. And if it is determined that a patient cannot manage their own estate, the attending medical practitioner would issue a Form 14, Certificate of Mental Incompetence. The copy of Form 14 is provided to the public trustee as soon as possible if circumstances require the public trustee to immediately assume management of the estate. And if after further assessment the patient is determined to be mentally competent to manage their estate, again, you would continuously do assessments to determine their mental competence. Then a Form 15, cancellation of Certificate of Mental Incompetence, would be issued. So you can issue a Form 14 Certificate of Mental Incompetence, but you can cancel that at any point once the medical practitioner is comfortable that the person can manage their estate. So again, if a Form 15 cancellation of Certificate of Mental Incompetence is issued, then the public trustee would be notified and provided a copy of the certificate. And And if a patient's Form 3 Certificate of Involuntary Admission or Form 4 Renewal Certificate are canceled, and Form 14 is still in effect, that Certificate of Mental Incompetence, meaning to manage their estate, the director of the designated facility would inform the public trustee that the person is no longer an involuntary patient. Then there's mentally incompetent to consent for treatment. And that is, people have the right to consent to or refuse psychiatric and other medical treatment, and refusal of treatment is one of the patient's options if the process of consent is to be meaningful. The attending medical practitioner who admits a patient, voluntary or involuntary, so remember this is for both voluntary or involuntary, is responsible for examining the person as soon as possible after admission to a designated facility to determine if the person is mentally competent to make treatment decisions. The attending medical practitioner will continue to periodically assess the patient to determine whether the patient is mentally competent to make treatment decisions. And again, if they determine after completing that assessment, they believe that the patient is not mentally competent, then there's Form 11, Treatment Decision Certificate is issued. So that is filled out with their observations and reasons that provides evidence for their opinion that the person is not mentally competent to make treatment decisions. And again, this could be taught, like this is, you continuously assess and reassess the person because they could be mentally incompetent, but then they could become competent to make treatment decisions. And if that happens, then a Form 13 cancellation of treatment decision is issued by the attending medical practitioner. But in the interim, if a Form 11 treatment decision certificate is issued, then you would seek out a substitute decision maker to represent the patient. So Form 12, designation of substitute decision maker, is completed. And again, there's an ongoing assessment to determine competence. And as I said, a Form 13 can cancel it. So you have Form 11, treatment decision certificate. You have Form 12, which provide the designation of substitute decision maker, and we'll talk about that process in a couple seconds. And then Form 13 is cancellation. Cancellation notice is provided to the public trustee, patient, and all other persons provided with a copy of Form 11. But Form 11 is automatically canceled when the person is no longer a patient of the designated facility. So this applies to both voluntary and involuntary patients. So when a patient doesn't consent to treatment, they can only be treated if they or their substitute decision maker consents. If it's determined the patient is mentally incompetent, the patient cannot legally consent to treatment, a substitute decision maker would be found who can make treatment decisions on behalf of that patient. And if a patient is mentally competent to make treatment decisions and they refuse, the medical practitioner may provide the treatment if an order from a review panel has been provided. And also, if the patient's substitute decision maker does not consent to that treatment, same as above, treatment can only be provided with an order from the review panel. So we've talked about mentally incompetent to manage estate. That's Form 14, and the cancellation is Form 15. Mentally incompetent to consent to treatment, that's Form 11. 12 is substitute decision maker, and 13 is cancellation. So let's talk about the substitute decision maker. That's a person who's designated to make treatment decisions on the patient's behalf if the patient is deemed unable to make their own treatment decisions. Did somebody have a question?
Yeah, I just had a question. I know you're just going through the substitute decision maker, but just on the comment about contacting the review panel, I see on the form 1 there it has the address and phone number and stuff. I'm just wondering, is that something that will be available 24 hours a day or on weekends and stuff if we get into a situation?
The forms will be available 24 hours a day. The office itself won't be open 24 hours a day, but you still will be able to send that information to the office, which is actually situated in the 6th floor of the new government building in Yellowknife, and they would get it Monday to Friday. But there are timelines, and we'll talk about that once an application has been received.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so substitute decision maker is designated to make treatment decisions on the patient's behalf if the patient is deemed unable to make their own treatment decisions. So again, we said Form 11, treatment decision certificate must be issued before a substitute decision maker is appointed. And when Form 11 is issued, the attending medical practitioner or possibly the director of the designated facility, and again in practice I expect it will be the attending medical practitioner with the help of the health team, will seek out a person to act in this role. And the substitute decision maker is designated via Form 12, designation of substitute decision maker. But in order to be a substitute decision maker, they must be available to make treatment decisions on behalf of the patient. And by available, we mean they must be able to, they don't necessarily have to be right there in that community. They have to be available to participate in telephone conversations or teleconference kind of situations. So they could be somewhere else, but they need to be available to take that call or to talk to the healthcare professionals. They need to also be willing to assume responsibility for making treatment decisions on behalf of the patient, and they need to be mentally competent. So if the patient is a minor and someone has lawful custody or lawful authority over them, or if the patient has a legal guardian or agent of the patient under the Personal Directives Act, that individual would automatically be selected as the substitute decision maker. You wouldn't go seeking any further. But if none of those apply, then you would actually, shoot, I forgot to write down the section of the Act. In the Act, there is a section that actually talks about your nearest adult relative of the patient, and that's in quotes because adult friend is also in that list. And the nearest adult relative would be the first of the following persons who is the oldest of 2 or more relatives in the same category. Now you do have a list, and it's a spouse, child, parent, sister or brother, grandparent, grandchild, aunt or uncle, niece or nephew, or adult friend. Section what? 30. So it's section 30 of the Act. Thank you, guys. And so if you want to take a look at that section 30, it says nearest relative means with respect to a patient, the living relative of the patient, as I said, first listed. But what you also want to do is find the right person. So if a person, when they're competent, has said, you know, I know that sometimes I'm not able to make decisions on my own behalf, and I have a really close friend who I would like to be my substitute decision maker, you would try to respect those wishes. You're not going to go to the spouse or others if they have already said, this is the person I would like. But because we don't always have that information available, people don't always expressly state who they want to have as their substitute decision maker, excuse me, then this hierarchy has been developed. And so they would be designated to be a substitute decision maker. So example, a patient is married and has 2 adult children who are in contact with and support their mother, and the marriage is a sound, happy, healthy relationship. So based on the criteria listed, who would be considered the nearest adult relative, the spouse or the oldest of the 2 adult children? The spouse, yeah, that's right. So the spouse, because I mean they're first on the list. So a patient not in a relationship has 2 adult children who are in contact and support their mother. The children are 25 and 21. The patient also has an older sister who she's close to, and the sister is 60 years old. Who would be considered the nearest adult relative? The 25-year-old, the 21-year-old, or the older sister? According to the hierarchy. Did somebody say something? I missed it. The 25-year-old. Thank you. That's correct. Yes, thank you. Sorry, I missed that. But also the patient is given the opportunity to choose a substitute decision maker. So in this situation, again, with the patient who has 2 adult children and a sister she's really close to, she's said all along that she's very close to her sister. She doesn't want her children taking on that burden of being their substitute decision maker. So could we actually ask the sister to become the patient's substitute decision maker, given the wishes of the patient?
Yes.
Yes, exactly. So we want to make sure it's somebody that the patient trusts, and as best as we can. So we want to support their decisions too. So the nearest relative can only be designated as a substitute decision maker, though, if they've been in personal contact with the patient within the past 12 months. They have to be willing to assume responsibility for making treatment decisions on behalf of the patient. And they would also make a written statement certifying their relationship with the patient, that they've been in personal contact and they're willing to assume responsibility. And that is all a checkbox on the Form 12. And the substitute decision maker is responsible for supporting and advocating on the patient's behalf, making decisions based on the best wishes of the person, considering the person's wishes if they're known, and applying to the Mental Health Act Review Board on the patient's behalf if it's necessary. So they're gonna make decisions that are going to support the person, ensure that the expected benefits of the treatment outweigh the risks. They're gonna ask all kinds of questions to support them, and they're their advocate too. So the patient doesn't lose their right to be informed. So the patient and the substitute decision maker have the right to be informed about the care and treatment, including the purpose of recommended treatment and hope for effect. And the substitute decision maker role ends when the involuntary patient is found to be competent to make their own treatment decisions, and Form 13, cancellation of treatment decision certificate, is issued. It ends when the patient is no longer an involuntary patient at the facility. It ends when a review panel would change the substitute decision maker because it has felt they're not fulfilling their duties. This requires an application to the review board. Or it will end when a review panel makes an order to cancel Form 11. So if I could get you to look at flow chart 4 in your packages of flow charts, you will see that there's competency and substitute decision maker. And again, on the left-hand column where it starts involuntary admission, that's accessibility to manage a state. So that left-hand column looks at managing a state. You'll see that there's a line and an arrow that goes from involuntary admission over to the blue box voluntary admission, because remember, assessing to make treatment decisions is for voluntary and involuntary patients. So that right-hand column is the steps and the processes with the forms on determining competency to make treatment decisions. So if you want to take a couple of minutes, I'll let you look through that. And if you want to pull out the forms, it's 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15 in your binder. The substitute decision maker only makes treatment decisions, not managing a state.
Okay.
I didn't quite catch the question, but from your answer, I figured it. Yeah. Only through parts 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That might as well go all the way to 6. This is SAM. I want you to read through about SAM. This is trying to apply everything that we've talked to this point into a case study. Remember, it's a case study, so there's a lot of detail there. give us a break if it's not quite the right order, but I think it's pretty fair. And then just take a look at it in that context, because it walks you through the different forms that we've talked about. It walks you through some situations and some considerations. So just do the case study of Sam up to part 6, pages 2 to 10. Does everybody have the case study available to them? Hopefully. Okay, I'll give you 5 minutes to look through that and then have some discussion amongst you. Patient continues to be an involuntary patient under the Act, but can leave the designated facility if the attending medical practitioner grants permission in writing. And the purpose is usually therapeutic and provides an opportunity to assess the patient's ability to function outside of the designated facility. Initial leaves of absences can be quite brief, and then they extend over time. So I mean, there is a process that happens, and conditions can be imposed, such as attending specified appointments or taking medications as prescribed, but the conditions again should be least restrictive. So short-term leave can be granted for anywhere up to 30 days. And so that is a new form and new process from our current Act. And the attending medical practitioner will issue Form 16, short-term leave certificate. So the patient, or if applicable, their substitute decision maker, must agree to the short-term leave before the certificate can be issued. And it's important to note that this is different from the current practice of writing pass orders. The certificate is automatically canceled upon the expiry date and time stated on the form. But if it's deemed necessary to cancel the leave, the attending medical practitioner can issue the Form 17, cancellation of short-term leave certificate. So for example, if one of the conditions was that the person was to attend a specified appointment and they did attend and there was some concern at that appointment about them deteriorating, whoever they were actually meeting with could actually get in touch with the facility to say there's some concern, and the attending medical practitioner could actually cancel that short-term leave certificate. Notice of cancellation then would be provided to the patient or anyone else who received a copy of the short-term leave certificate, and then again, the attending medical practitioner can cancel the short-term leave if the patient's mental condition changes. Form 17, the cancellation certificate, would be filed with the director of the designated facility, and if the patient doesn't return to the designated facility as required, the attending medical practitioner or the director of the designated facility would issue a Form 18, unauthorized absence statement, to have the patient apprehended by a peace officer and conveyed by a peace officer or other authorized person back to the designated facility. Any questions about short-term leave? Again, you have you would look at when you're wanting to cancel. So Form 17 for cancellation, Form 18 for unauthorized absence. And again, being reasonable, if somebody is saying going on a weekend pass and they're supposed to be back at 5 o'clock on Sunday and they don't quite make it, they're not there by 6, you would know your person well enough to know whether you should actually do an unauthorized absence statement or not, or whether you should give them some latitude or leeway and try to connect with them to say, hey, and they could say, you know what, we got caught up, we were having dinner, we're late, we'll be there, whatever. So you give them a chance to, rather than just authorizing or submitting an unauthorized absence form and going out and sending out search. So short-term leave can be anywhere up to 30 days.